call up our presentation for today. So we begin, as always, Benum Christinet. I greet Christ in you. I'm delighted to have you here this morning. And there you go. You should be able to see that now. So our opening prayer today comes from 139, Psalm 139. And before we begin, I very intentionally chose all of our prayer this morning from the Psalms, in part to sort of give us, even in this short space, a sense of the span of the range that the psalmists cover in terms of expressing the human experience or the human condition. And as you'll see, they quite closely interrelate with the readings for today. So let us begin. This is from Psalm 139. Where shall I go to escape your spirit? Where shall I flee from your presence? If I scale the heavens, you are there. If I lie flat in Sheol, there you are. If I speed away on the wings of the dawn, if I dwell beyond the ocean, even there your hand will be guiding me, your right hand holding me fast. I will say, let the darkness cover me, and the night wrap itself around me. Even darkness to you is not dark, and night is as clear as the day. So our first reading today comes from page 62 of Contemplating Christ, for those who would like to follow in the book. I'll begin with a summary of the psalm that we closed with last week as a way of contextualizing what follows. And notice the stark difference between this psalmist's prayer and the opening prayer we just heard this morning. How long, O Lord, will you remain hidden? Forever? Is your anger to go on smoldering like a fire? Remember me, how long have I left? For what pointless end did you create all the children of Adam? Who can live and never see death? Who can escape the power of Sheol? So this next section begins with the subtitle, A History of Longing. These questions, as existential as they are universal, strike at the heart of our self-imposed exile. Yet the gift of exile is longing, a hidden seed planted secretly in the core of the forbidden fruit of ego, which we inevitably ingest in our frenzied consumption of all that is illusory. That wardrobe I accumulated leaves me unsatisfied. The dream home I always wanted has now become a financial albatross. The latest technological gadget I thought I needed is soon obsolete. That promising new book on spiritual enlightenment has just proven another fad. The spiritual practice I thought would save me has since grown dull and tedious. And that brings us to our meditation this morning. So we'll close there. Our second reading this morning can also be found on page 62. So the inevitable dissatisfaction that arises in the wake of our lists and wants and agendas is not arbitrary. It is the symptom of a divine ruse. To be human is to long, and nothing save naked union with God will ever fulfill that longing. Indeed, nothing can. All of us, therefore, begin the contemplative journey convinced that we are in a state of exile, longing for the divine intimacy of Eden. As we will see, the incarnation is God's response to all the children of Adam who have cried out with the psalmist through the centuries, "How long, O Lord, will you remain hidden?" And this, the very gift of our longing, can only come about because we have already been found. So our closing prayer this morning then comes from Psalm 63, verses 1 through 8. God, you are my God, I pine for you. My heart thirsts for you. My body longs for you. As a land parched, dreary, and waterless. Thus I have gazed on you in the sanctuary, seeing your power and your glory. Better your faithful love than life itself. My lips will praise you. Thus I will bless you all my life. In your name lift up my hands. All my longings fulfilled, as with fat and rich foods, a song of joy on my lips and praise in my mouth. On my bed, when I think of you, I muse on you in the watches of the night, for you have always been my help. In the shadow of your wings, I rejoice. My heart clings to you. Your right hand supports me. And that brings us to our sacred sharing. So, as always, you have the floor. Whatever questions or comments you might want to share, please feel free to do so. And we'll try to unpack a bit of that. Next week, by the way, will bring us to the end of this chapter, and we'll be moving 2 weeks from today into the following chapter, which will begin to respond to many of the questions that are arisen here. So.
It makes me reminds me, my work has been with addicted people. It makes me realize that often it has been said that the desire to be transported in that way through drugs is a way of the desire to be in another a desire for God, you know, that it's often that desire to be transported to another place, another being. Yeah, I guess I said what I wanted. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that, and there are, some, more so-called psychedelic types of drugs that do seem to alter our state of consciousness to some significant degree. And it's understandable that for some people, and even in some cultures, there are mind-altering drugs that are part of ritual practices, I think, as a way of attempting to experience that bliss of consciousness around union, or sort of dropping away of ego or a sense of division, for sure. Yeah. Thank you.
But as with almost everything that we use in that way, we start to focus on the thing itself.
Exactly right, which is
and
why
then it takes over, and it's all
right. That exactly right. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, within the context of the spiritual life, I always want to encourage people to remember that although it doesn't necessarily feel that way, very often the driest prayer, right, the prayer full of what the mystics would call desolation, around, without feeling any particular bliss or joy or even satisfaction, is often the most beautiful and pure form of prayer, because it really is that, as the psalmist said, this, like we're like dry land, right, parched and waterless, just thirsting. And it's in that deep desire that some of our purest prayer, I think, emerges. So we don't want to be discouraged if within the context of our prayer we don't feel that. Okay. All right. Let me just, if I can, I'm trying to figure out how to apparently have an upgrade on Zoom here, and I'm not sure how to determine the order of hands as I used to be.
I think Pat was first.
Okay, then go right ahead, Pat. Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
Father Vincent, could you, I have a couple of things. Could you please expand some more on that last sentence in the reading? And this, the very gift of our longing can only come about because we have already been found.
Yeah. Thanks, Pat. That's a great question. What I'm trying, and this is the text you're referring to, yes, the one I just highlighted. Okay, yeah, just so people could see that. Right. I think that in what follows next, actually, so what we look at next week will provide a much longer response through an anecdotal story to your question. But I think that the very seeking is in itself a grace, right? The very idea that we are seeking God is in itself the grace to search, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And so what I'll say in this, I don't know if you have the book on hand, but if so, I would encourage you to read through the end of the chapter over the course of the next week, because what it will do is it'll explain that, as I say, anecdotally. I think the idea that we're searching means we're already longing for God, and that longing, I believe, is in itself a grace.
That we don't long unless God called us to long.
Yeah, in a sense, that's right. And as I talk about in that paragraph today, to be human is to long. I mean, there is a sense in which we are constantly confronted with the desire, right, for something, right? And as Ignatius says, beneath all those desires is really one unified desire, and that is the desire for God. As we just talked about a moment ago, even the desire for, say, a shift in consciousness around the use of drugs is in itself a desire for something beyond, right? And that beyond, ultimately, what rests behind all of those things is the divine. That's really the one thing that fulfills. But it comes about precisely because within the longing within human nature, that desire for longing, I think, is a grace in itself. Is God already calling us to that? Right.
Okay. And Father Vince, would you please bring up the closing prayer once more?
Oh, of course. That would be Psalm 63, verses 8-1.
Yes. Okay. Verse 4. That one really struck me, because as I was reading along, as you were reading out loud, I inserted the word, I lift up my hands. That's what I just kind of naturally came to. And I'm looking at, no, it's God lifting up my hands.
Oh, Um,
Is how I'm
I
now seeing, is another way that I'm seeing this verse.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see why you would see that with this particular translation. I think in this case, the psalmist, or at least the way it's translated, it drops the I. And so, in other words, I think what's being said is, "Thus I will bless you all my life. In your name I will lift up my hands."
Okay,
But
so I could be there. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's the proper interpretation in
Okay.
here. But often, because it's assumed, it's dropped
Okay.
for poetic reasons. And so, however, that said, I don't know that you need to let go of your inclination to see it, right? Because if we are talking about God, the grace of God being the thing that actually provokes the longing,
Yeah.
we read just recently in this meditation session that the Spirit prays even beyond words, where we don't have the ability to pray ourselves, prays within us. And one could certainly see in this verse a kind of correspondence to that. So I wouldn't necessarily throw that out.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Mary Sue.
Beg your pardon, Robert? Yes, I see Mary Sue. I figured it out now where I'm at here. The hands used to be little blue hands. Now I can't see them as well, but I'm starting to get the picture. Okay, so I think Mary Sue, you were next.
Okay, thank you. This is the first time I've ever said anything on here, so
Glad you
I'm
are.
bringing out my courage. What struck me also was that sense of that longing that oftentimes is tied to all kinds of different addictions, how we try to fill that longing with so many different things. But what really resonated with me was in that first reading where it talked about even the search for, the spiritual search, trying to fill it with more spiritual reading, more input. And I know that, for me, oftentimes I feel like a sponge that I just want more and more and more, and sitting in the silence, trying to let that drop is really kind of a challenge. And so I don't know if there's more you want to say about that, but it struck me so strongly that that's exactly what I experience, is that it's that thirst, it's that desire to be, to soak it all up. And at the same time, knowing that I can't make that happen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think so. First of all, that paragraph is as autobiographical as anything in this book. So I speak sharing that experience with you of that, in fact, I open my very last chapter, which you'll all forget because we won't get to it for another year or two. But in that chapter where I really focus on prayer, I talk about one time when I was in college, a monk once said to me, essentially, you could read all the cookbooks in the world, but until you feel the heat of the oven, you're never going to bake a loaf of bread, essentially. And this was exactly the point he was making. We could read all the spiritual books and the how-tos and the manuals and all of the lofty language around that, but you just got to get into that oven and feel the heat of it, or else, reading the recipe doesn't feed the hungry. So you have to. So that is a very real experience. I think for many of us, and indeed a temptation, right? While certainly spiritual reading is important and I think helpful, nothing beats the practice itself. And that is much more difficult to do than I think particularly the early practitioner realizes, right? When you really stick to that. Which is why community like this is so important, right? To keep bringing us back to the practice.
Mm-hmm.
So
Thank you.
I say that, Mary Sue, to encourage you that you are not alone in that experience at all.
No, I don't feel like I feel like, and there are other communities too. I know that that's not, I feel like it's a good place to be.
Yeah.
In a sense, recognizing that thirst, and also recognizing that, I can't fill it by trying to read everything.
Right.
That has, it's the surrender piece.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you mustered the courage to speak today. Very insightful.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Gerald, please.
Thank you. I think what I had in mind has already been covered, but in fact, I love what Robert just put up. If I hadn't tasted Cadbury's fruit and nut bar, could I long for it? And it takes me back to, at that moment of creation, I believe our souls were created. And that longing is that natural desire to return to the loved one, to the ultimate reality. And no matter what we do, we're not going to fulfill it. But to me, that's the beauty of the contemplative practice, is sharing those moments, so to speak, with the ultimate reality, with both ourselves and the ultimate reality, knowing that you're not getting there. You're not there yet. You're not going to. But it's okay to love that longing. And yeah, something was mentioned about addiction and so forth. I think that to me, that is probably the heart of so much of this, is that we naturally long for something which we know is better. And we mistakenly take the drug or the psychedelic or the drink, or we go shopping, we buy the new sweater or the new pair of boots, whatever it is. I have a real problem with cowboy boots. Anyway, I won't go into that. But I thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. You're right, and I want to, kind of referring to what your kind of response to Robert's post there about the chocolate. When I was in college, I had a professor who was Jewish who was teaching sort of a course in Old Testament, and we had a very close relationship. But he practiced kosher, and I said, "You mean to tell me you've never had a piece of bacon?" And he said, "No, never." I said, "Professor, you have no idea what you're missing." And he said, "You're right, I don't." Right. And in a sense, he didn't miss it because it was never really part of his cuisine. And I said, wow, I feel sorry for you that you don't know what a good piece of crispy bacon tastes like. So but there is that sense in which not having it as part of your diet, you don't miss it, right? So you have to know something. And that's indeed a nice way of thinking through the grace piece. It's the grace that entices us. And it's that's what I'm trying to say is that ruse, that divine ruse beneath all of our longings. It is really a longing for God. It is really that, right, that we move past and grow into the dissatisfaction so that there's something more, there's something beyond. Remember the poem of the Great Cry. There's always something beyond what we think is our limit, even when that becomes, that's the abyss and that's me. And so you have to keep going. And in a sense, that's it. If you've ever had that experience when you were younger, or maybe not younger, where you go on a shopping spree and then all of a sudden you realize that's it, all that time and energy, and that's all it is, right? It's sort of that disappointment, or in your latest technological gadget and so on. So beyond, that's the divine ruse, the dissatisfaction, the thing that keeps edging us on to desire something deeper and more real, is what I'm referring to there. So thank you for that, Gerald. Lydia, hi, it's good to see you.
Good to see you. Good morning. Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Father Vincent, my question is also in the same lines of longing. And I think my intellectual mind is trying to understand, these lines in your book that says to be human is to long, and nothing save naked union with God will ever fulfill the longing. And I guess I'm trying to get some type of relief because, like Mary Sue said, I have this desire and this longing for knowing more about God, you know, I bought a bunch of books, which, you know, I will never have the time to read all of them, right? Every opportunity that I have to sign up for a retreat or, you know, like a communion, like these groups, I will do it at some point. Sometimes I feel like, oh my gosh, I think this is just greediness, you know? So I'm trying to balance, you know, this, and at the same time, because I had experience of grace. I mean, it has changed between grace and, I don't know, bliss, and I don't know. I mean, just a complete joy. I feel like, oh, other people needs to go through this experience, and I don't want to impose in other people either. So I don't know, I'm trying to find a balance, but so yeah, I don't know if, I heard also somebody saying, you know, we have to learn to surrender and, you know, and not to keep feeding this longing. So yeah, it is challenging.
It is challenging. You know, I think you're right, Lydia, that there is probably most of us have more books on our shelves than we'll read or read in their entirety as we build our libraries. That's probably a very common experience. And I think Amazon has fed that capacity to an unbelievable degree. But I think that you're right that so one of the things I guess I want to make clear, I think we've talked about this before, is that part of what we read in the experience of mystics, to use that term, sort of in quotes, is that we reach a state in the spiritual life at some unspecified time, whereby there is the realization, intuition, that because God is infinite, trying to love God is like being on a boat trying to reach the horizon. It keeps the closer we get, the farther it becomes, right? Because that's infinity. We could never actually get to that horizon, because when we get to the point, as far as we can see, it continues farther, right? As far as we can see. So because God is not finite, but is infinite, then so too, the experience of wanting to love God remains forever unsatiated, because God is too big for us to love as much as we recognize we are loved. And that tension, wanting to love God as much as we begin to feel or experience God loves us, becomes, for the mystics, this thing they talk about is actually a source of spiritual pain, almost like a certain anguish, or whereby we recognize an unfulfillable desire is in us because God is too big to ever encompass with our own love. And that variance, that distinction, becomes both an experience of being loved unconditionally, of being loved in an overpowering way, and that itself becomes a beautiful experience, but at the same time, an experience of intense spiritual pain by which we realize we can't reciprocate it, just because of the fact that God is infinite and we are finite. And that's sort of just the difference between those two. It's difficult in a world that we live in and where we have grown uncomfortable with complexity. We kind of see things as opposites, where in the spiritual life, I think we need to be holding them in tension, like utter bliss and incredible spiritual pain, that these two things actually are deeply wed and inseparable. And that it's just a very complex thing to try, I think, to describe. But what we tend to do is go after the bright, shiny objects, which might be our next theological book, or the next retreat, or the next spiritual method that I'm being taught. We go after those because they feel more encompassing. They feel more like something we can get a handle on. And indeed, I don't want to discourage you from doing that, certainly to an extent, but to be able to step back from that and ask, how many cookbooks have I read compared to how many loaves have I baked? Let that be a kind of marker for all of us about where we need to be spending our time, right, in opening up to that divine experience. Why most of us experience in our prayer that sense of dryness, that sense of desolation versus consolation, I think is in part a function of this ruse, because it continues to call us beyond. Otherwise, we would just become addicted to that blissful experience in meditation. But it's really to purify us beyond a feeling or desire or something that we can attain or get our hands around, versus something that really calls us way beyond that. And that is, for many of us, a lifelong process. But I do think for those of you who know even a glimpse of an experience of union or being loved, it shapes us for a lifetime. So, Lydia, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think your very question is already showing you're on to where you need to go. It's a question of going.
Yeah, I'm just trying to balance and not go overboard.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Of course. Okay, Linda, hi. It's nice to be able to see you on camera. Let's see, did we lose you? I think we lost Linda, right? Does anybody see Linda there? No, right? Okay, when she comes back, we'll call on her again. So that brings us to Pat.
Okay, I was struck by, Robert's comment about the Cadbury candy bar and yours about your Jewish colleague. So I'm wondering, in my experience, much of the church has not taught about divine union of Christ incarnate in me, the contemplative life, deification, these things that I'm finding are life-changing for me, and I'm sure for others. So if we're not being exposed to this by the church, how do we know to long for these things?
Yeah,
why has the church failed to do this, I guess, is my question.
Yep, it's a great question. So I'm hearing maybe two prongs to the question. The first is, if the church is failing, where does it come from? Yeah. I think it comes from every experience we've ever had of authentic beauty, full stop. And I don't think that the church can particularly circumscribe that or has necessarily an upper hand on that. Beauty is beauty, and it will be experienced where it is. And by beauty, I'm not, and we'll talk about this in chapter 4, I'm not talking about the commodified kind of beauty that we promote in capitalist society, of a shiny sports car, or, all of these kinds of things that we try to sell as beautiful. I'm talking about experiences of transformation, experiences of real deep down beauty in creation, those things beauty that transforms rather than simply draws us outside of ourselves to want empty things, right? That's maybe a simple way to try to put that. So I think when we experience beauty, forgiveness, reconciliation, somebody's life transformed, and so on, there's something that gets evoked in us, right? And calls us, in a sense, out of ourselves. And I think it's precisely on the grounds of beauty that the churches have largely failed us. They have stopped being places that transmit beauty, the church, right? And just for example, when I look at modern church architecture, which in this country anyway is a lot of square concrete boxes, which have absolutely, in my opinion, no aesthetic appeal. And the justification is often, well, what's beautiful is what happens inside. So we're just creating basically a big concrete box for something beautiful, as if the building itself shouldn't convey something of the beauty of the tradition. And I find this disturbing, actually, this notion. And I guess there's probably a broad spectrum of opinion on whether or not my assessment of that is at all correct. But when I look at the beauty of European churches, you just can't beat that, right? It brings you to this place of awe. So how do we, as a church, or as our churches, transmit beauty? How do we become agents of transformation in society? How do we really embody the radical transformational message of the gospel in a way that is so beautiful as to become compelling, right? We tend to want to use our pulpits to work on behavior modification in people, what you should and shouldn't do, a kind of ethics of this or that, rather than a place out of which we communicate the love of God as the ground of all being, right? And as the basis for everything that we do, right? Coming into a deep realization that, as I'll say later in the book, not merely that that you are loved, but that you are love incarnate. And we don't hear that message. And I think somebody, I think on this, might have been Carol, who several weeks ago said, the church has just sort of been reduced to sin management.
Yeah.
Right. And rather than transformation, and this is all based in fear, because we all become afraid that if we're not coloring within the lines and we're not doing what Father who knows best is telling us to do, and if we go outside these, then somehow we're going to be in mortal danger. Some infraction that we'll commit that will somehow send us spiraling into the depths of hell, as opposed to saying, hey, this is about going out into the world and setting it on fire with the love of God by reflecting in people's own lives that they are loved, that they are love incarnate. And in the process, you're going to screw up. It's just the name of the game. We're going to make mistakes. People are going to get hurt. You're going to say the wrong thing. You're going to step on someone's toes, and so forth. This is, if you want intimate community, then you're going to have people who make mistakes. You're going to have to reconcile. But we've just reduced this to behavior modification, and our churches, by and large, are social clubs. I go for my hour and I'm done. But many of my congregants, who are some of the sweetest people I'll ever know and most beautiful people I'll ever know, will often compliment me, say, on a sermon. But my thought is, if it hasn't transformed you, then it's not a good sermon. It's just a bunch of pretty words. So how do the goodness of the sermon is the extent to which it creates transformation, right, in each of us. And that real living out of a transformed life, beginning not with how I modify my behavior to be acceptable to God, but to know, really, really know that I am an embodiment of love. So I can communicate that to anyone who doesn't know that they are an embodiment of love. That is, I think, where our churches fail to give us the guidance we need.
If I could say one more thing, I also wonder too, institutionally, churches have, like, for example, the Baptist Church, the Southern Baptist Convention was basically founded to uphold slavery. We have the limited role of women in the church. In Germany, it was the church, other than heroes like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who made Hitler's rise to power possible. And all these things, there has to be an other to be oppressed. And if that's the worldview a church is coming from, is there has to be an other, then it stands to reason that union would be put to the side or rejected. Because if we have divine union with God, that means we need to have union with one another, and then there can't be the other to be oppressed.
That's right. That's right. Which is why in my last chapter, where I talk about contemplative discipleship, I use the analogy of needing to drop our nets, right? When Jesus calls his disciples, he says, leave your nets behind, not get a bigger net. And the reason is because, we all have our nets that divide between us and them. And wherever the edge or the boundary of your net is essentially where your compassion ends. So the question is not to get a bigger net. That's right. The fish in the ocean are far greater. No matter how big your net is, there's a lot more in the ocean that extends beyond it. So in the call to discipleship, we're called drop your nets altogether. Drop that boundary that otherizes ultimately. And if you look at the trajectory of Christianity through history, it has been a history in its most authentic nature of expanding that sense of bringing in the other, starting with the Gentiles. And if you look at Paul's letters, that was not an easy stretch for the original Christians, who were Jewish in orientation, to accept. It was a hard-won fight to get them to drop that otherizing tendency. And that's where it began, but it goes on from there. So whenever a church embraces its own institutional forms over against embodying the gospel, well, now we've got an us versus them mentality, and it's very hard to shake that. And the church will do what it needs to do to defend its reputation,
yeah,
and to defend its existence as an institution, even if that means lying and deceit and so on. It's a very dangerous game. And to be honest, we could point to specific examples, but I don't think there's any institutional church today that's been around for more than about 4 minutes who isn't guilty of that at some point in history. We all have our skeletons to deal with. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful. So if you, as you'll see as we move on through the book, these very things will be addressed because they need to be. Yeah. All right. Okay. Richard, hi. Good morning.
Hi. Good morning, all. 3 mysteries are afoot here. The first is, what a great lament. Not an Episcopal whining, not a Protestant whining, but a full-blown lament is presented here, lamentation. And it's one mystery is that it's that if you do something fully, it leads you through it. You can go through it into the opposite that you alluded to. The second mystery Pat alluded to, about agency or non-doership. I confess I cheated, and over the holidays read through the book all the way to the appendix, where deification is pointed out as the divine calls one to it. It's not something that one can force oneself by whatever action. The lament about clothing not satisfying, I'm good with all that, until it got to books. And it quite hit home. I've been trying so hard, and only Maximus the Confessor advised, you won't find what you're looking for in these books.
Of course, that was before mine was written. So if Maximus had only read...
Exactly. Not this book.
Right, not this one. Of course, that's always, I should have put a footnote, accepting this one, but okay.
Yes, and a third mystery, the remedy for the return to the garden. I have a friend, a priest, I talk with too seldom, and Father Paul was administering to death row as his assignment. And he said, Richard, I find more love here than in all the world. He said, I pick their spiritual wallet. I empty their spiritual wallet, and I take it all, and I give back them just a little bit. I'm a thief. He's confessing that he's getting more riches from them than he is giving. And I interrupted his retreat with my call, and he said he was in prayer in his room all the time. And he said, Rich, read Psalm 131. So I read it to you here. A song of quiet trust, a song of ascent of David. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, my soul is like the weaned child that is with me. my searching for grandiose understanding through deep theology and searching endlessly is brought to rest in Psalm 131. So, third mystery. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for those reflections. Yeah, one of the things we're going to find is that while our temptations for bright, shiny objects may look different, it's really all the same thing underneath, right? So, so thank you for that. Joan, please.
Yes, this thought came to me back with the remarks about how come the church doesn't encourage, teach, and lead us into our own contemplative search and so on. And I think this has kind of been said in the further discussion, but I didn't hear it specifically. I mean, there is the plain and simple fact that the institution cannot control that. Once they let you loose to follow God's call to you personally, they cannot control it, and that's hard. An institution, it's kind of against what an institution is about. I mean, it's and part of it is plain and simple a desire for power on their part, and part of it is I think a sincere fear that you will hook up with the devil or do something dangerous to yourself if they don't watch you like controlling a child. So there's that. I mean, about the institution, and yet without the institution, we need it. I mean, it's that kind of a dilemma, which is the way it is. So anyway, thank you.
Yes, you're right, and the church is always in need of reform, and when the mechanisms of institution don't permit it, the reform happens anyway, but often then results in schism or splitting. I mean, if you look at the history of many of the reforms within the church, frankly, the reformers had it right, and many of them were not intending to divide or separate. It's just that the reforms were resisted to the point that was unfortunately the inevitable result. So, each of the sort of schisms or divisions in the church have their unique history and sort of theology and personalities, and probably some wrong on both sides. But a lot of it really was unnecessary, unfortunately, but for people preserving their power or some aspect of the institution that they felt was threatened. But, the history of looking at reform within the church, but also reforms that don't lead to schism. For example, the Second Vatican Council is one of the great modern reforms within the Roman Catholic Church that led to just tremendously beautiful shifts in its approach to the world, and very, very powerful changes that did not end really in a few small groups splintered off, but nothing major. I mean, it really kept its integrity. So not all reform leads to division, and the best of reforms don't lead to division. But many of the various communions of churches were founded or came about because reforms were necessary, and the institution at large would not embrace that or roll with that on any level, give credence to it. So, okay, just the last two comments from Denny and then Jennifer, and then we'll move ahead for a discussion on practice. Denny, please. Hi.
Hi, Vincent. Just very quickly, what I'm hearing you say is we already are what we are seeking. And I believe that to the core of my being, that is true. I think the problem that I see in the church, and I'm an ordained minister in the church, is the concept of sin. If we would use the real translation of sin as missing the mark, then we wouldn't have to say people are condemned for all eternity to be tortured by God. It's just missing the mark, that's all. I think that's what addictions are. I think that's what too much spiritual reading, I think that's what all of it is. It's kind of like a child. I used to take my youngest daughter out for walks, and she would absolutely stop and look at everything. And I always wondered if she wasn't looking for God. But you know, that was just kind of missing the mark. She was in the presence of God, but that was just missing the mark. And
Right.
so I see the contemplation as the place where I can not be in charge, where God can be in charge and show me really where the mark is. So thank you. I think your teaching is right on the mark for sure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Denny. I appreciate that approach, and yes, I would agree with you 100%. Where what makes the gospel good news is that we are already found, and that we already are what we seek. And in fact, to me, that helps to explain what the contemplatives have done with the myth of Adam and Eve. The very issue is they sought to become God apart from God. They sought to be God apart from God, rather than to recognize they are already in the divine image, and therefore participate in the divine on this level, right? So whenever we seek as a commodity something that really is born of intimate relationship, we're going the wrong direction. This is and the great gift of the gospel, and why it's not Pharisaism, is because there isn't this thing where you have to prove yourself worthy and then finally achieve salvation. It's been won, right? It's a given. So thank you. I appreciate that. And we'll be spelling out those implications throughout the book. All right. Thanks, Denny. Jennifer, please.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to say, I just love how you keep reminding us that that we are love incarnate. And I wonder sometimes about the leaders of the church. I think so many of them have good intentions, but I'm not sure that they understand that they are love incarnate. So it's hard for people themselves that aren't on that journey, or maybe haven't had experiences of transformation, to lead us in that direction. And so I have gone mostly to progressive Protestant churches for most of my time, and so many good intentions, so much desire to go out and be beacons of love in the world, without really any guidance around how to be a beacon of God's love in the world. It's kind of just like go out and do it, and not really even acknowledging how hard it is, how we need God to do it. We need a practice, all those things. So I'm kind of stating the obvious, but I just wanted to say, I don't hear a lot about sin, and maybe I should hear more. I don't know. I hear a lot about going out and really doing good. And I have found it dissatisfying to not then also have that guidance, that support around grounding myself in God's love, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate, and I think you're right, Jennifer, that is often the case, and that one needs to only look at your own communion and look at your seminary training and ask how much of that is dedicated to teaching priests about the life of prayer, or ministers about the life of prayer. Like, how much of our seminary training is really about deepening life of prayer? Precious little, I think, in most cases. And so the end result is the church is all about, teaching us how to drive a car, but nobody's ever put gas in the tank. And you're not going to get very far that way. You can know all the rules of the road. You can understand where the gas pedal is in the steering wheel, but if you don't have gas in the tank, you're not going to get anywhere. So what is that fuel that drives us, if you want to say? And that is grace, and that is our encounter with grace. So if the leadership, both lay and ordained within the church, are not, if this isn't getting infused, then it's a problem. I have a friend who will be giving a retreat this coming year online through St. Columba's that looks at building contemplative parishes. He's an Episcopal priest. Stuart Higginbotham is his name. Some of you may know that name. He co-published a book on sort of up and coming contemplatives in the world. But he has a parish out east, Grace Parish, Episcopal, and he is really trying to infuse that parish from the ministry of the leaders down through the congregation about a sort of Christian approach to mindfulness or contemplative practice, and ask, what does that mean? How does that transform who we are and what we do in the world? And his book is forthcoming this year, and I've had the opportunity to read a version of it and critique with him some comments I had. So there is a movement in which we're trying to actually systematically address this question because it's huge, but I don't think it's one that we're ever going to find a perfect solution for, because it would require the church to become things that feel counterintuitive institutionally, right? Where you want a system of safety, a system of right and wrong. I forgot who was, Richard was saying that he read the book to the end, and in the appendix, I really look at this question of how many of the mystics, particularly in the high medieval ages, became somewhat threatening to the church, because if you can have a bona fide encounter with God apart from the mechanisms of the church, especially if you're a woman, you become kind of dangerous. You don't need your priests and bishops anymore. You don't need the sacraments necessary, because you're having this, or claiming to have this direct encounter. So this becomes threatening. The contemplative life is a little bit threatening to institutional forms of life, but I think somehow they have to learn to coexist and feed one another. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to move ahead. I see some hands are up, but I did want to draw a hard stop here. Just those of you who have your hands up, just keep them up for now. I do want to convey the practice for anybody who may need to go, and then we can come back to looking at some Q&A. So contemplative practice for this week. So I'm going to ask you to spend the week meditating on something that you've longed for and acquired. So pull out some of those old Amazon books you haven't read yet. Perhaps it could be a work of art, a piece of clothing, a new gadget. But I want you to notice how fleeting and how empty, right? And then begin to notice what that emptiness reveals. And to use the language of the book, can you see in it the divine ruse? So let some object you longed for or really wanted or desired that you've achieved, you've acquired, and just bring that into your meditation corner and see it for what it is. Notice it for what it is. See its emptiness, and then ask what's being revealed in that emptiness, the divine ruse. Yeah. I'm going to make a quick cut and paste of that, which in a moment I'll paste it up here so you can all see that for those of you who need to. But before I do that, let me just come to the last week's practice, which we'll open up and bring into our discussion as well now. So last week's practice, which I opened the floor to, when longing rises up, go down into it. And let it wash over you. This is the sacrament by which you may know the grace of God's longing for you. Again, what does it reveal? So we're playing with these notions of longing, of desire, of emptiness. So I asked that when you felt a sense of longing come up in you, to be with it, to go down into it, let it wash over you. Don't necessarily respond to it. And to think of it as a sacrament by which the grace of God is revealed as longing for you. What came up in that? Okay, just going to take a moment then and place that in the chat box if I can find it. Okay. There you go. That's for this coming week. Okay, so let's see, starting with Anna, please.
Okay, so I think there's some technical glitches because I had my hand up from nearly the beginning of
Oh.
the previous thing. And then when you talked about the last people, it was like, oh, but I have had my hand up for a very long time.
Yeah,
So I put it back up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It never did show. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. And I'm thinking maybe there's some little technical things because it also had a screen freeze on one person for a very long time. But that's not why I raised my hand. And I think it's providential that I'm speaking now because kind of what I'm going to say relates to the practice, longing and contemplating. So the minute you talk about ovens and bread, and you can read all these books, but if you haven't baked the bread, people that know me know I love to cook and may not know, unless you've known me a very long time, that I've been a collector of cookbooks forever. I have never met anyone that has more cookbooks than I have. A bookcase. I have books under my stairs. I have books and boxes in my garage of cookbooks with beautiful photos. And I've had a lot of issues with dieting. So one time I thought, well, maybe I should just give it up, but not give it up to like eating food, but maybe I should take out my cookbooks and just read them. And that will satisfy my cravings for food. So I did this practice and it helped somewhat, but I realized that, looking at a picture and a recipe of a cream puff is not the same experience of actually eating it. And so, and then I thought, oh, these days I'm collecting spiritual books and I don't have enough time to read them, but what's really important is the experience of, being in communion with God and meditating more than reading about the meditating. So that's what I had.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. Spiritual food, physical food, it's the same, right? It's not as satisfying, but we tend to go to those bright lights, the nice pictures, the beautiful concepts, the nice flowery images. But then when we're left with the heat of the oven, sometimes it can get, pretty uncomfortable for a while. And yet working as you do for a bread company now, right? An amazing bread company, in fact, one of the best I've ever known. Brick Maiden isn't gonna pump out all that amazing bread if the owner just stares at cookbooks. So at some point, you've got to bake. And that's a wonderful analogy, Anna. So thank you. And you're right. I've never found it satisfying to look at a picture of a cream puff. Doesn't quite cut it. All right. Paloma, please.
Thank you. So I wanted to thank you for the message, which is on point as often it is this week. I wanted to ask, one is for help with this reconciliation when one falls off in relationship, either with oneself. I had some experiences over the holiday of being with family and being in kind of a self betrayal. And then, or in relationship, we're under COVID and lots of stress. Sometimes we get on each other's nerves, reconciliation. And then third, with the institution, sometimes deep institutional hurts, or again, sense of betrayals that occur institutionally that can last for decades. Mm-hmm. For me, being cast out of a monastery that was men and women and kicking all the women out still hurts. So just wanting to get some practical tools on reconciliation, and then feeling deep resonance with the shiny objects law thing. Although I'm now thinking of cream puffs. Thank you. I appreciate the cream puffs. I just came from being with my sisters and dispensing of the last of my mother's belongings when she died. And there were moments of almost like mortal combat over a scarf or over, a piece of jewelry that she designed among the 5 sisters. So the shiny object thing is really deep in my immediate memory. So thank you, and looking for assistance on mortal combat over shiny objects or reconciliation.
Well, thanks, Columba. I think that anecdotally points to the shiny objects and scarves and the points to essentially the same dynamic that is in fact going on when we're drawn to objects, that we're drawn to them because they symbolize something, and it's what they symbolize that is what we attach to, right? That if I have if I'm really striving, which is already problematic, to say be a contemplative, and I have a bookcase of contemplative books, that's going to reinforce that desired identity, that sense of this is who I am in the world, and I have all these resources. And so I'm pursuing out, sort of what Denny was talking about earlier. I'm pursuing outside of myself something that's already within, and I want to have these books because they help to reinforce a sort of metaphorical, symbolic way in which I want to think of myself, or the story I want to construct around myself. In this case, a scarf that belonged to your mother is more than just a piece of cloth. It's something she wore. It's something that has a history with her. And so it's a connection to her symbolically. In that sense, it's almost sacramental, right?
The tree of life pendant that she designed before she died. That was like a mortal combat object that we almost killed each other on. The tree of life pendant. This is
right. Okay, so we can, and we can understand in that, then I would hope, that institutions are no better than individuals, right? So that we get into mortal combat with each other, institutions fighting over whether the Trinity should be talked about this way or that way, or whether the Pope should have this kind of power or that kind of power, or whether the Eucharist means this or that. And these sources of division and separation and hurt are all over not the thing, but the weight or the symbolic connection that thing tethers us to. And I think the response is always the same: to step back, right? And to detach. This is Meister Eckhart. Detach, he says, you can't love purely if you don't detach perfectly. So we detach from the scarf, from our articulation of things, from our favorite tradition, or whatever the case may be, so that we can prescind, if you want to say, move away from the mortal combat, and instead see that my sister, for whom that pendant means as much, is a person who deserves to be loved, and so on, right? And so as is the case always, wherever you have the individual ego, you have the collective we-go, as it's been called. I didn't make that up, but I think it's a helpful term. And all of these things coalesce, right, and build, so that you have entire communities battling mortal combat over symbolic attachments, because they tether us to something that we believe is deeper than that. That's where our attachments lay. And it's why we have to find ways to see in the exercise I'm trying to offer for this week, the emptiness behind the things we're attached to, and then to ask what is revealed in the emptiness, right? And I think that becomes the beginning of reconciliation. So thanks, Paloma.
Whoa, thank you.
Yeah, good. I hope that helps a little bit. Thank you. Okay, Linda, please. Sorry for wait.
Hi, sorry about before the electricity went out.
Oh, you're
I think
fine.
in the neighborhood. So I wanted to ask, well, I have a lot of, I'll just try to read it to one question. When I was actually trying to do a longing exercise this week, and found that there's something that feels intentional, like I am now sitting down too long, versus something that the grace of longing that hits me. And what I found was, when I was trying to pay attention to longing, I couldn't find it, but I did create environment. Like, I put on early chant, and I lit candles and was in a dark room. And all of a sudden the environment lent itself to a longing that I'm not sure what the point of that is, but the question I wanted to ask, which isn't related to that, is why so few of us seem to be called to that inner contemplative place. You know, I was talking to my mother and sister yesterday, and they think I'm out in Mars. You know, they just absolutely cannot figure out what this spiritual stuff is that Linda's involved in. My dad, who was in the seminary to become a Catholic priest, couldn't understand what all this spiritual nonsense was. You know, and when I've been in a church before, a Catholic church, where we had meditation once a week, and, you know, 6 people showed up in a congregation of 500. So, you know, there's something about that. Is it that God, I mean, I believe that we are all by nature, God is our true essence. But it's so, you know, peculiar to me why, one, so few seem to be called to that deeper place. And then I start wondering about what's faith versus longing versus want, but that's sort of heady, you know, vocabulary stuff. So if you can glean a question out of that, God bless you.
Oh, no, thanks, Linda. Actually, it's very nice. I'll speak briefly to the first thing you said about longing, which is kind of an awesome concept. You know, what you're saying is you can't will yourself to long, which is itself very insightful. You can't just say, okay, long, and have it like happen, right? It's sort of like, you know, you can't go on a retreat and say, you know, in the span of 72 hours, you will have a spiritual experience. You just can't falsely produce those things. And that's a really excellent point to make, that because it raises the question, then where does longing come from when it is there? What is its source if I can't will it, right? Where is it emanating from? So I'll leave that as an open question, but your opening comment really has got me thinking about that a bit. So thank you. To your second piece, my sense is that the contemplative life is indeed a universal call. And I mean, well beyond Christianity. I think it is a call to authentic living, right? To really living to the full. I also think that it's a difficult call because if we're going to look at it in an intentional way in terms of trying to cultivate it, it's like growing your own vegetables versus walking into the nearby grocery store and just picking up a bag of frozen peas. The cultivation comes with its own gifts, its own connectedness, right? You're connected to the ground, you're tilling the soil, you're working the land, but it's a lot of work, and it's a lot easier to walk into the grocery store and just pick up a bag of peas that somebody else has done the work for you. And I think in a lot of religion, it's the grocery store mentality that's promoted. You know, here's your sacrament, you know, here's your baptism, here's your Eucharist, here's your confirmation. Here's your fix of hymns this week, and so on, versus the call to the deep connection and the reward that comes from the cultivation itself, not just from the bag of peas at the end of the day. So there is a universal temptation to want convenience, to want the simplicity, to want the you know, the prize in the package. But I do think it's a universal call, and I think we are in a time where this is not the first time in Christian history, to be sure, where that has been, the call to contemplative practice has sort of gone well beyond monastic calls and mendicant orders and so on. We see places in Christian history where this deeper summons has sort of been made explicit. But I do think we're in a time when we're also beginning to question what the contemplative life is, and not assume that it's just one thing, like what most of us have probably come to think of it as: sitting in prayer, meditation, all of this. I think there are some building blocks that make it difficult. Sitting in silence, right? Not reading, but being in the heat of the oven, and so forth. But, you know, there's a lot we're learning now about different cultural approaches to contemplative practice that look quite different in terms of the mechanisms that lead to an experience of communion, an experience of union, an experience of connectedness, from, you know, tribal traditions all the way on up to virtually everything else. So there may be more connection to the contemplative life than we as yet realize. because we've been sort of all trained to think of it as. And as you know, Linda, I know you're connected with the CAC, with Richard Rohr's group. You know, you're there, I think, exploring through the work of, is it Barbara Holmes? Is that, did I get her name right? Yeah. I mean, she's doing a lot of that exploration too, around a joy unspeakable and so forth. So I think there's a bunch of things going on. One is, I think it's broader, more available, and actually more connected than right now we realize, because we haven't yet quite appreciated beyond our own way of being contemplative. I also think the other side is true, that modern, particularly Western cultures, are cultures of contemplative avoidance by and large, and that we are, in a sense, cultivating a culture of bright, shiny objects, not necessarily because it's evil intention, but because it's lucrative. I think that's what's at the base of it, that it's, you know, whenever our culture can get us to pay for bright, shiny objects, whether it's a new book on spirituality or a new, you know, dress or a new sports car, we've bought into it, right? They're all just shiny objects, and we value them differently. But they're bright, shiny objects. So there's this temptation to go after that, because the inner work of really looking at what the contemplative life calls us to is difficult, is very difficult. It's hard. It's tilling the soil versus grabbing the bag of peas.
So why are some of us why are some of us interested in tilling the soil? I mean, I understand what you're saying about the contemplative life being difficult, but then that would be like the 8 people who show up in my church for the Tuesday night. That might be 2 of them out of 8 decide, this is too hard, and they leave. But what about the 500 that remain in church? I mean, I have sat around a coffee table with, you know, 40-year church friends. I mean, you know, who absolutely don't get it, even when I want to talk about God, let alone that the leaf on the tree is making me all woo, because it feels like God. So yeah, I guess it's just that sort of selection, you know. And then I think of the Hindu, you know, that yoga in Sanskrit means to yoke with the divine, and the physical yoga is just part of one. Anyway, there's 4 categories that they lay out. One is that based on our proclivities, that we all want to move toward God, but that there are 4 tendencies. So like bhakti yoga is devotion, people who like liturgy, etc. There's karma yoga, which is good works. You know, you do good works, but you don't stay attached to the fruits of your labor. And then there's jnana yoga, which is intellectual discernment. I think I'm getting these right. And then raja yoga is like the meditative path. And then the physical yoga that we are also used to is part of that. So is it a proclivity thing, or like, you know, Barbara Holmes, there's something in the Black church where rejoicing, you know, that sort of getting beyond the body, getting beyond the ego through exuberance. Right. You know, bhakti yoga, I guess, is that equivalent to this quiet contemplative space, based on proclivity, based on culture? I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I think it's many. I think it's all of that. I think it is personal proclivity. I do think it's culture. And I think there has been a tendency, say, like if you just look back in Christianity, how all of the books on contemplative life have really come out of monasteries until very recently. I mean, the vast majority. There's nothing wrong with that. But it really is one slice of the pie as to what it would mean. You know, if you had, I mean, you know, I've often come to think that one of the most deleterious influences in my life on a simple contemplative life has been the academy. You know, the honed it is very hard for me to not be critical of a theological proposition, to just sit with it, right? To just be. And that's that third kind of yoga you looked at, right? I think it was the third one, the intellectualizing, right? So those two. So sometimes when I just want to sit in the presence of the infancy narratives during the season of Christmastide, all of my historical critical bells are going off about what's inconsistent and how this happened and what do I get from that, right? As opposed to the capacity just to be present in the heart to the story, to the truth of it. So, and on the other hand, that side of my training has profoundly enhanced my prayer life, my spiritual life, because I see things that I think the average person might not be trained to see. And that opens up whole new ways of reading the text and understanding the experience of God through it and so on and so on. So a lot of it could indeed be proclivities. One of the things I say in the book somewhere, I can't remember, is that, the contemplative life is like sowing the seed in tilled soil. But those seeds, generously sown as they are by God, could grow up just as well in untilled soil, right? If the farmer just misses the edge of the farm and gets some seed out off the other side, that there's nothing to say that won't also grow up. It may have less of a chance because you haven't prepared the soil, but seed generously sown will grow where it will. And in a sense, I think you're onto something to say it's about proclivities. It's about who we are as persons, right? So there is a general avoidance even among those who are drawn to the more contemplative minded way of being. I think we experience our own blocks and our own distractions, but I think you can see in an entire culture of different ways of both being contemplative, but also different ways of being distracted.
And the 500 in church?
Yeah, you're 100% right. I think it comes back to Robert's Cadbury chocolate. They just haven't tasted it yet. And if the church would cultivate a taste for chocolate, we might see that 500 expanding into this, but we don't have institutions supporting it. I think that's a real problem. And I don't think it's one that will be easily resolved, but
Maybe institutions are meant to do institutional work, and it's okay they do social work, and I don't know. It's also complicated and so easy at the same time.
Yes, you're right on both accounts. Yeah. But I've always thought there's never going to be a contemplative megachurch for that reason, that it really is just difficult work of any spiritual path. I mean, one could ask, when you look at the people struggling with addiction in the world, why are so few in AA? I think it's the same dynamic, because the bright, shiny object of addiction, alcoholism, right, or drug addiction, is the easier path on many levels, even though it's the more destructive path than doing the hard work of the 12 steps. 12 steps suck. I mean, it's hard work. You really have to, but the rewards of that are life transforming. I know a lot of people get upset when you look at the early fathers who warn about the passions, and we all tend to get guilt-ridden about that. But if you really read it in the context, they're right. The passions, that the body desires and attractions and cravings really do dominate if we don't keep them in check. And and whether that's anger or greed or lust or whatever it is, those things can easily become the dominating force in our lives, to which everything else becomes second. And that's why the church in its early teachings is so forceful about cautioning around that.
Shiny parasites.
Shiny parasites. Yeah, we'll be getting to them. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Let's see, Sylvia, please.
Good morning and Happy New Year, everyone. Hi. I wanted to hear your reflection on, for me, what in this specific instance is a very nuanced and complex relationship with longing. And I mean, many people here know that my husband is very ill and has been for a long time. And he recently had a major setback. It cast him back many levels, and he's in 4th stage heart failure, and we're hoping that he can resolve it a little bit to get back to upper level 3rd stage. And his daily suffering is oh, it's just astonishing. And even to the point where some friends say to me, if they were experiencing what he is, they don't think they would want to keep living. So it's quite a journey. And so my relationship as the caregiver, the sole caregiver, especially with COVID, is this longing constantly to, how can I ease his suffering? How can I show up? How can I make this better? How can I help this incredibly narrow razor's edge path even back to a little bit more ease? And when I'm longing, when I'm with him, what I've realized is that my longing actually separates me from him, because I'm wanting it to be different. Even though, of course, I want what's happening to be different. Of course, I don't want him to be in pain. Of course, I want him to be able to breathe. Of course, I want him to be able to stand up. But I've realized that when I'm with him, my longing separates me from him. But when I'm longing alone, my longing becomes a prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in that sense, my longing does unite me with God, because it turns into prayer without me thinking of it as prayer. It just moves like a color becoming another color, in the rainbow. So my question to you, or what I'd love you to reflect on, is the longing for his suffering to be eased. And I get that as not being with what is exactly in the present moment, with exactly what is. How, maybe you could help shine some light on that complicated relationship.
Thanks, Sylvia. It's, thank you for sharing all that. I do know what you and Lat are dealing with now, and I know it's difficult for you to even talk about. And my response, I think, is more to reflect back to you what I'm hearing, and maybe you'll hear it slightly differently, or maybe in a way that helps to link it. I've mentioned before, I think that Meister Eckhart says the purest form of prayer is the prayer we don't even know we're praying. And you've made an allusion to that, in this sense of longing becomes the prayer. I would caution about thinking of the longing as separating on the basis that it's not accepting what is, because the longing is part of what is right now. You see, right? And what is that longing born of? Your love for him, your devotion to him, his love for you. And it's that longing that's transforming you from, say, inaction, a passive bystander, to one who is becoming for him that presence, healing, love of God. So the longing isn't simply not being present to what is. The longing is part of what is right now. And of course it's part of what is, because you love him. It's like, the grief I feel, the sadness and grief I feel over the loss of my dad is the love I have for him. It's the only way I can love him anymore, right? It's in the grieving that the love becomes experienced as grief. It's not a separate thing. The longing you have is what is born of his suffering, is born of his heart condition, is what is. And by moving into that longing, the prayer, the purest prayer of embodied longing, is the thing that makes you the agent of healing for him, the presence of the divine in his life. So I see no separation in the longing. I see a moving into what already is. And it is your prayer, and it is you as Christ for him. It's all of a piece.
I can't thank you enough. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Anna, please.
So I'm going back to Linda's comment about the 500. I immediately felt a remembrance of hearing something about the priests in our local area being pressured by the soccer moms to only have 10-minute sermons. And I thought, ooh, wouldn't that be terrible? I mean, imagine only having 10 minutes of Father Vincent a week. I mean, well, the wisdom that you bring, I mean, it's really enlightening and fulfilling. And, you know, but that wasn't my point so much, even though that's the truth of it for me. It's that our modern life, it's gone beyond, you know, people not quite being into contemplative life. It's that people are on this wheel, you know, like a gerbil running around, and it's getting faster, and people don't realize they're so distracted by modern life that, you know, we have play dates for kids. I know play dates has been a thing for a while, but when I was growing up, you just went out and played with the neighborhood kids. There was time. And in my grandfather's time, you know, I think people were naturally more contemplative because it was an agrarian life. When you're plowing, he even had horses, you know, to plow the land. You're smelling the beauty, the God in the nature and beauty. And so you could naturally feel a little more drawn to contemplative. But when you're on this rat wheel, this gerbil wheel, I mean, how do you get off? What makes you recognize, unless you intersect with someone that really has a light, or you just get discouraged by, you know, the trappings. Anyway, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but it just felt like something to share.
Thank you for that. And I appreciate that. And I think you're right. And I do know that many of my colleagues here in Marin, who are priests, are indeed told, you know, 7 minutes, and we got to be out of this church within less than an hour because we got soccer practice. I mean, so you're right. I mean, Linda, maybe that comes back, you know, to your question or what we're talking about earlier. I mean, there's just no fostering of that. I mean, forget anything else. I don't know how anybody as an Italian would expect me to say anything in under 10 minutes. I just couldn't do it. It's just not part of my nature. So how do we really create a desire, right, for that hunger, and to give them something to give the church, the people, something that is beautiful and worth staying around for. And that certainly goes beyond a sermon. That is, how do you establish an intimate, loving spiritual community that becomes in itself the draw for what people are seeking, right? I mean, one of my sisters has said to me point blank, I want to go to church for an hour and I want to leave. I don't want to sign up for anything. I don't want to register for anything. I don't want to get involved. I don't want to volunteer. I want to do my thing and leave. And I think a lot of people just feel that that's the case, right? And that's essentially what they do. So if it feeds them, fine, but I don't know how to respond to that, right? I don't know. Maybe if the church itself that they were attending offered something that was more beautiful, that would shift. But where does that start then, is the question. So thanks, Anna. I appreciate that. Right. Okay, so I see, I presume I'll be able to read a lot of those chats after the fact. I see we're coming up on the hour. I'll go ahead and read those chats after our session today. But I do want to thank you all for being here this morning and for your beautiful questions and introspections. Next week, we will close out this chapter, so the reading will be a bit long. I think it's necessary to not divide up the anecdotal story I try to tell there. And then 2 weeks from today, we'll begin the following chapter and really move on to quite a different subject. So I want to thank you all again. I hope you all have a very happy, safe, most of all, healthy and joyful 2021. I don't think any of us will miss 2020, but let's hope that whatever kind of manure was thrown on us then will become fertilizer for 2021 and see what grows from that. So that would be the best thing to happen. So I bid you all benum Christinit, and thank you for being here again today. God bless you, and have a lovely week, and I'll see you next weekend. So go in the peace of Christ, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. And we'll see you guys soon.